Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in tonight. On behalf of all of us at Books and Books, I'd like to welcome you to a virtual evening with Carlos Lozada to discuss What Were We Thinking? A Brief Intellectual History of the Trump Era, published by Simon & Schuster. Carlos Lozada is the nonfiction book critic of The Washington Post and winner of the 2019 Pulitzer Prize for Criticism. As book critic for The Washington Post, Carlos read some 150 volumes, claiming to diagnose why Trump was elected and what his presidency reveals about our nation. In What Were We Thinking? Carlos uses these books to tell the story of how we understand ourselves in the Trump era, using as his main characters the political ideas and debates at play in America today. Carlos will be in conversation with Mitchell Kaplan this evening. Mitchell is the owner and founder of Books and Books, which he opened in 1982. All of you watching can order your copy of What Were We Thinking from Books and Books below by pressing the green button at the bottom of the screen. Every purchase you make keeps Books and Books up and running, so we thank you and we remind you that we need your help now more than ever. We'll have time to take some questions from the audience at the end of their talk, so please put them in during the broadcast anytime, and we'll get to those at the end. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the stage. Here's Carlos. Here's Mitchell. Okay.
Hey, Carlos, welcome. Welcome to this Books and Books event. It's great to see you again, and it's great to have you here.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
You know, it's hard to have you, a book critic who also is a political journalist who started out that way, without talking about the events of the moment, literally the moment. I was watching CNN before we came on, and as you know, it looks like the end is near. Given what you have read and given what you know, where do you think we are and where do you think we might be going with Trump over the next couple of weeks?
When you say the end is near, of course, it sounds like you're referring to the announcement that the General Services Administration, the agency that's in charge of enabling the transition to a new administration, has basically begun that process, which it had been holding up for a few weeks now. And so in that sense, it does look like the sort of acceptance of the inevitable is happening in the Trump administration. That said, even if we're saying goodbye to the Trump presidency, I don't think that we're really saying goodbye to Trump or to the influence of Trumpism in American politics. The fact that this election was not a full-scale repudiation of Trump, but that he actually won more votes than he did in 2016, suggests that there is some appeal, some continued hold over the Republican Party and certainly Republican voters that I imagine other politicians or maybe even Trump himself are going to want to continue controlling and dangling, into the Biden administration and even 2024.
Well, so many people have been puzzled by his absence, except on Twitter. He hasn't had a press conference. He hasn't even had a barrage of questions under a helicopter. He's been basically absent since the election. Is that something that you might have, that in any one of the books that you read over all this period of time might have prepared you for? Or is it as surprising to you as it is to so many others?
I think the absence during this transition period has been surprising, in part because this is a president who craves the spotlight and who relishes the more atmospheric parts of the presidency, right? It's always been the rallies and the speeches and the signing ceremonies, not the nitty gritty of governing. And so that absence has been surprising to me. That said, I think that his reaction to the election and the sort of unprecedented way in which he responded to it by simply denying reality and then seeking to subvert it is very much in keeping with the kind of analyses that I found in these books. In particular, I would point out a book called Unmaking the Presidency by Susan Hennessy and Benjamin Wittes that shows where all these norms of presidential behavior that Trump has been violating came from, how they built up around the presidency, and what it means for the institution if they are simply disregarded or actively violated. And by his final act being this continual denial of the results of legitimate election, that feels like almost the ultimate norm broken, which is that of the peaceful transition of power.
Well said. And I know we got a little ahead of ourselves. What we're talking about is, as Christina said, what were we thinking? This is a brilliant, brilliant book. We spoke earlier. I've now had a chance to look at it once again, and it made me even that much more impressed with what you did and how you approached it, and then how you were able to synthesize it in this book itself. So let's start at the beginning, Carlos. Actually, I want to start at the beginning. Now that we're talking books and books, we're a South Florida bookshop. I assume most of the people on this are from South Florida, and many of them probably don't know, but you do have a South Florida connection. Why don't you talk a little bit about it?
Yes, my parents both live in Miami, as does my sister, who's a law professor at FIU. And I have an even more intimate connection to books and books. And my niece, Sabrina, who's also a college student now, she was an intern at Books and Books. So it was a thrill for me.
And a very good one at that. Lovely,
I have no doubt.
Lovely.
I have no doubt. And so even though I've never lived full time in Miami, it's where we came after I finished high school in Peru. And so it's where I often go on holidays. It's where I visit my family all the time. Not lately because of COVID, but I feel a very close affection and affinity for the city and for the bookstore. Another sister of ours who passed away, unfortunately, was a huge Books and Books fan, and so it's exciting for me to be able to do this tonight.
Well, and we're excited. The way it works with us and with us at Books and Books is that you have that kind of connection. You're one of us, so we call you one of us. So
I'll take it.
You're there. So let's talk about the genesis of this book. How did it come to be? Why did you decide to go down this road that you went down?
I started down the road long before I thought there would be a book at the end of it. I had just become the book critic of the nonfiction critic at the Washington Post in 2015 for just a few months when Donald Trump announced his candidacy. And so at that point, I thought, well, why don't I read some of his books? Some of his own ghostwritten books to see what they reveal about him. Even ghostwritten books can be very revealing about how someone wants to be perceived. And so I asked my editor what he thought, and he said, yeah, it's a great idea, but hurry up, do it quickly because interest won't last in this guy. This is a flash in the pan kind of thing. And that was July of 2015. So I started reading his books. Then as he started doing well in the primaries, I started reading the books that were coming out about his supporters, the books about the white working class that started to emerge. And then he wins. And after he won, there were all these books written by the resistance authors. And I started reading and reviewing those. And that's when it hit me that this had become my beat, my job at the Washington Post, that all the big debates of the Trump era were going to be litigated in some way through books, in writing. And so I started reviewing both one-off books and also kind of clusters of books that would come out on a related topic, whether that was books about truth or books about impeachment. And it was just after the midterm elections in 2018 that I thought that maybe there was something I could say about these books collectively, that that instead of tackling them one at a time or a few at a time, I might try to see what, in a sense, what people were thinking, how we were grappling with Trump and Trumpism in real time. I started it off as a piece for the Washington Post. I quickly realized that I had much more to say than I could possibly say in an essay for the Sunday paper, but also much more to read. There were books I had missed and books I knew were coming. And that's when it struck me that this whole thing could be best executed in a book project. I wasn't sure where it was going to go. I didn't have my finish line, my big idea, or my main conclusions thought out at the beginning, but I figured getting there would be interesting enough.
So what were, when you started going down this road, when you understood that this was something that could be an important project, which were some of the first ones that you reached for?
That was almost the hardest part, to figure out how I was going to divide and conquer the Trump library, right? How I was going to figure out what the categories of books were. So I ended up reading maybe I had read maybe 80 or 90 of the books already, and then I read some 50 or 60 more books just for this project. But I knew that I wanted to begin with one of the earliest debates about Trump, and that is his supporters, and all these books that emerged about the so-called white working class in America, starting with Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance, but so many more. And so I knew that's where I needed to start. And then, but really the hardest part in working through it with my editor at Simon & Schuster was precisely to determine, what are the relevant categories, what needs to be in this book and what doesn't.
Well, interestingly enough, Hillbilly Elegy was written, I believe, prior to Trump in a sense, or it was started before Trump. And it reminds me that, and I think we've spoken about this before, it reminds me that when Trump first kind of got elected and surprised us all, the very first thing that I saw as a bookseller where people were trying to make sense of it was in fiction, believe it or not. I mean, Sinclair Lewis's It Can't Happen Here, even 1984 began to sell once again. So talk a little bit about that, the role of fiction as it plays. I know it's not necessarily what you were doing, but what did you notice during that period?
I think the way you explained it makes a lot of sense, because the overwhelming response early on was just sort of surprise and shock. Even among Trump's own team, they didn't expect that he was going to win. That the world would align precisely the way it did in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan, and in a sense, because it seemed so unlikely, so otherworldly that someone like Trump could become president. I think part of that was why people reached for these works of fiction. I did that too. Like during the campaign, I read Sinclair Lewis's, It Can't Happen Here, Philip Roth's The Plot Against America. During the transition period, the equivalent period into which we're in now, right? But 4 years ago, that's when 1984, when Margaret Atwood, when all these books came back in vogue, and in some ways, they were the best option available at the time, because in nonfiction, it's almost like we hadn't caught up yet. We hadn't figured out what to say about it. There's one work of fiction that I'd want to highlight for folks tonight, and of course, my book focuses almost entirely on nonfiction. But there's a novel called American War by Omar Ellicott that came out in 2017, I believe. It was early on in the Trump presidency. And like Hillbilly Elegy, it was a book that had been conceived of long before Trump. But it imagines a second American Civil War set some 50 years from now, in which red and blue America are no longer just election night constructs for John King and the Magic Wall on CNN, right? They're actual physical hardened political realities in the country. The country is split. Climate change has run its course. So, Florida, I'm sorry, is the Florida Sea. The capital has relocated to away from Washington to Columbus, Ohio. That's how you know you're in a real dystopia, when they put the capital in Ohio, because that always seems to happen. And you see how the political divisions and the polarization that has run so rampant today, in this telling, really morphs into something far more dangerous. And I remember thinking at the time that this really could be a sort of a classic Trump era novel. Like it got great reviews in the Washington Post and the New York Times, but it didn't kind of take off in the way that I thought it did. But especially looking at it now, 3 years later, there just seem to be real flashes of plausibility in parts of the story. And so maybe there's ways in which fiction will continue to help us, and frankly, in which satire will continue to help us as well. I mean, that's a form that people have used to deal with Trumpism as well.
Well, our very own Carl Hiaasen, with his new book, Squeeze Me, does just that. So I think I heard somewhere, and I don't remember where, but someone once said every book can be a Trump book in some way.
Yes. And, even books that, like, as I said, Hillbilly Elegy was not, as you said, it was not conceived up with Trump in mind, doesn't mention Trump, but it became a Trump book because people turned to it to glean some kind of insight and understanding into how Trumpism happened. And you've seen a lot of that throughout this presidency. That, books, a book like White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, they got a lot of attention in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd. It became a big bestseller, even though it was out a few years earlier. Became, in a sense, a book of the Trump era, even though it's not really about him. And right. I think depending on where we are, we find not only that we evaluate the same book in different ways, but we come to new books that help us make sense of this moment.
I think some of the best books that we've read during this period, and some of the best books that appear in your book, are the books that are not specifically about Trump. I mean, we can talk, we can talk about Timothy Snyder, you can talk about Anne Applebaum, you can talk about a lot of people who are basically historians or political scientists. Excuse me for my dogs in the background.
No problem.
Political scientists who are talking just about the world in general, and by talking about what their area of study is, they basically draw parallels to where we are now.
I think that's true. That's actually how I end the introduction of my book, with the point that really the best and most useful books of this time, of the quote unquote Trump era, are not really focused on him. They're not the books that detail the day-to-day chaos in the White House. They're books that help us see that a lot of the big fights and conversations that we're having in this period are ever present in the American story. A book like America for Americans by the historian Erica Lee shows how, alongside the tradition of America as a nation of immigrants, is a long-running strain of xenophobia, of rejection of outsiders. A book like One Person, No Vote by Carol Anderson details the long history in the struggle for voting rights and the really insidious evolution of voting suppression in the United States in ways that are completely apropos of right now. A book like These Truths by Jill Lepore is a book that looks at how the struggle to live up to those self-evident truths of the Declaration of Independence is constant, and how our inability to quite get there is not a shortcoming of America, but is the definition of America. And so these books are, I would say, not quite comforting for the moment, but they certainly make it more understandable.
I bet there are people out in the audience who are wildly trying to remember what book titles you just said and are trying to scribble them down. So what I want to do is reassure them. So let's talk a little bit. I think the brilliance of what you did is you were able to put all of these books into different silos, the different silos where they where they belong. And then at the end of each chapter, you actually have a bibliography of all the books you talked about that belong in that silo. So for those of you who are all very nervous and worried that you weren't able to get the books that Carlos is talking about, all you need to do is buy What Were We Thinking? And you'll have a reading list that'll last for months. So why don't you talk a little bit about, you know, the form of the book and how you
Sure.
decided to put it in the way, you know, structure it the way you did structure it.
Mhm. And that really took me a lot of time. It's funny, as a book critic, it's deeply weird for me to read reviews of my own book, right? It's like, it's not the way it's supposed to work. I'm supposed to review the books, right? And you know, there was one review that said, I couldn't tell if it was damning with faint praise or not, but said that the most innovative thing about the book was precisely that structure. And I tried to make it a little bit thematic, but also chronological. And so the first chapter is all about, as I said, the books of the white working class. And that includes memoirs, it includes sociology, it includes economists writing about this. And it begins with books like Hillbilly Elegy and Heartland by Sarah Smarsh.
I love the way you called it Heartlandia, the first.
Yes. That chapter is titled Heartlandia, which I tried to think of kind of names for these genres. And as I mentioned earlier, the next wave of books that came out, or that began, all these waves kind of crash into each other. But the next wave of books that came out involved all these books about resistance to Trump. And so those are also a mix of memoirs and manifestos, and even sociological analyses of, you know, who took part in the Women's March, and, you know, who was part of these other protests about Trump, and also, you know, straight up political books saying, like, here's how we you know, put together a resistance. The third chapter is all about conservatives in the Trump era, and I was really interested in the fights on the right during the Trump era. That's between the never Trump Republicans, the more sort of sycophantic conservatives who just went all in with Trump from the beginning, and the intellectuals who are trying to retrofit an ideology onto Trumpism after the fact. I bet I'm going to have to read about a lot of the fights on the left during the Biden era. And the fourth chapter is about immigration, and those are books by journalists investigating Trump's immigration policy.
Again, beyond the wall.
Yes,
right?
Exactly. More memoirs and manifestos, and even one novel that became very controversial. Again, not a Trump novel, but a book that became a Trump book in the sense it's American Dirt,
right?
That imagines maybe kind of poorly imagines a border story, a border crossing story. The fifth chapter, I'm surprised I can remember all of them in order. The fifth chapter is about truth. Is about the debates over truth in the Trump era. So you have a lot of journalists writing here. You have philosophers. You have literary critics. You know, you have all these different. This is probably the one with the most varied set of writers weighing in. And
talk about some of those. Who are some of those writers that you have in that section? Because I found that section particularly interesting to me because of the variety of alternate thinking that was there.
So
I remember there was a book called On Truth, I believe, that was in that group.
The titles are sort of wonderful in this one because they're all very like terrifying, right? Like post-truth, the death of truth, truth decay, the death of expertise. My favorite is a lot of people are saying, which is one of the constant ways that Donald Trump would kind of inject falsehoods into the mainstream discussion, saying, look, you know, I'm not saying, just a lot of people are saying this, right? And but also you had books by journalists, Jim Acosta of CNN, and a book that didn't get as much attention as I think it maybe could have or should have is called Truth in Our Times, by I believe the general counsel of the New York Times, like the newsroom's main lawyer. And what he discusses, which I thought was in a way emblematic of that whole chapter, is that when he went into the Trump presidency, he thought he was going to have to fight over like libel laws, right? Or fight over, the First Amendment and have to like fend off lawsuits from Donald Trump over and over again. He didn't think he was going to have to fight over like the very nature of truth, right? And
Right.
What is accepted truth. It was, in a sense, he was girding for the wrong battle. And I think a lot of people were, because what Trump has done during this period has been to make sort of increasing demands on us when it comes to accepting different kinds of truths, right? The whole presidency began that first weekend when he sends his press secretary out to lie about the size of the crowd at his inaugural, right? But that's a simple lie, right? That's just like, look, here's the truth, but I want you to believe this thing that is not true, right? Like, believe a fact that is not true. But then it immediately moves into what Kellyanne Conway calls alternative facts, right? Which just suggests that, you have options, right? You can, it's like, thank you for flying with us, right? Like, this is your menu, and you can choose the truth that best suits you. And finally you get
and he's coming to the end of his presidency the way he began his presidency.
Yes,
having Rudy Giuliani come out with these outlandish notions of how he was robbed, in a sense.
Right, but that's a kind of lie that suggests like only my truth is the truth, right? So it moves beyond alternative facts, right? It gets to like, don't believe the evidence of your own eyes or your own ears, right? Or your own mind. Like, this what we tell you is the truth. And so it makes increasing demands on citizens and on voters. The sixth chapter is about identity, and that's been one of the most significant debates of this time. And there's been a real explosion in writing on identity politics. The memoirs of identity in this time have been very significant, and a lot of pushback on identity politics by some writers who fear that it sort of supersedes, that by sort of slicing and dicing us into smaller groups, we forget what it means to be citizens. We forget what it means to be a nation. And that debate, I think, has been, while frustrating to all sides, incredibly interesting to me as a reader. And so I've appreciated those.
It's interesting that Obama even weighed in on that to some extent, in his,
Yes.
with his book and with the talk about his book. And, he brought up, it was very interesting to me that Obama, which you reviewed beautifully. It was a really great review that you did. But the fact that Obama talked about, hearkening back to the days of Walter Cronkite, that we all need to have this common narrative that we no longer have, was really interesting to me. I'm also I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was going to change a little bit, but finish.
I was going to say is that in some ways, Obama, who, if you think, back to 2008, was seen as this, potentially transformative, progressive force in American politics, in his memoir kind of looks back on himself as sort of a middle of the road moderate Democrat, who people put way too many expectations on. And he has some hesitation about the kind of forms that modern progressive identity politics has taken. That's clear not just in his book, but also in some of his speeches as well surrounding the book and over the last couple of years. He's a little skeptical of sort of knee-jerk excessive wokeness. And it's interesting coming from him. Obama now feels like more of a moderating force,
right,
than the way, of course, he was depicted at the time.
I think he also had a big wake-up call in terms of how difficult it was to get some of these very progressive ideas, into fruition. Sure it comes out of a sense of frustration as well. But what I was going to say is in this chapter, I was really glad to see you include a book that I found to be absolutely fascinating by, again, one of our own, Janine Capot-Crusett.
Oh, yes.
Time Among the Whites.
Hialeah.
Hialeah,
Yes.
My Time Among the Whites. That was an amazingly wonderful book, I thought.
Yeah. That was just it's one of the books that I hadn't read at the time, and that only because of this project I was able to go back and read. And that for me was just, I mean, you rarely get that chance. If you miss a book, you got to just keep going, right? But here I had the chance to go back and read other books. And her story was so interesting because she begins basically saying, like, look, in being Cuban in Miami, like what she says is kind of like being a white person, because Cuban is like default, right? It's the default setting, the doctors, the lawyers, the teachers, the bus drivers, everyone, and it's only when she left South Florida and went to college at Cornell, that suddenly she felt her sense of differentness, and she embraced kind of Hispanic identity in order to survive in that environment. And then of course she ends up teaching English at, like, in Nebraska, right? And it's just a fascinating story where she is dropped into different places and feels different sides of her identity coming to the fore, which is entirely human, right? Like, we all, there are different moments when different parts of who you are become more important. Like, I went to Notre Dame for college, and so Saturdays in the fall, when I'm watching those football games, like, that's my main identity, right? Like that, that's the most important thing. Other moments, being a Peruvian immigrant is my main identity. Other moments, being a journalist is your main identity. And so that's what I appreciated about Janine Capot-Crusett's book.
And what's wonderful is that those books could have been written at a time when Trump wasn't even president, but
yes.
They reflect so much on he seemed to bring every conflict that we had as Americans. He seemed to bring it all to the surface.
In a single moment.
Maybe he was secretly doing us all a favor, that we had to confront all of these things that had been hidden for so very long. They all, every sort of ugly thing started erupting while he was there. So any of these books have a relevance to us.
And it's the books that aren't beholden to a particular moment that can explain so much about it, right? Precisely because they're not just stuck in a very narrow kind of blinders way, thinking about where they are right then. And so that book, My Time Among the Whites, was one that I was able to kind of add to my own reading list for that chapter on identity. The chapter of the book that people seem, at least people in Washington, seem most engaged by is the 8th chapter that I called the Chaos Chronicles. And it's all about how so many of these books that, often reported books, but also a lot of insider books by ex-Trump officials, how they all seem to follow a template that began with Fire and Fury by Michael Wolff, like the first big Trump book. And they're looking for, like, the craziest, oh my God, can you believe, he did that kind of anecdote from inside the White House. And you often miss, some of the more, interesting or relevant or meaningful stories that even these books themselves have, as a result of that focus at all these things that Trump does and has done in these 4 years, that after a while they continue to shock, but they really don't surprise.
And a lot of those books are books that don't have legs, so to speak. A lot of those books come and go, I think. But there's one that you list in that chapter, which I think will continue to be read, and that's Michael Lewis's The Fifth Risk.
Yes.
I think that's a book that will continue to go on, just in the way that Michael Lewis can, create his magic. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So most readers, and I count myself among those readers, know Michael Lewis from his, massive bestsellers, turned massive movies, like The Blind Side or The Big Short or Moneyball, or still my favorite is his first book, Liar's Poker. And yet suddenly he had this book that I didn't even know was coming. Like it just arrived one day
Right.
at the mailroom at the Washington Post. I had no idea that this book called The Fifth Risk was even being worked on. And what he did something so amazing. He well, first let me say, and we're learning some of this now during this transition, but by law, every outgoing administration has to prepare these detailed briefings for the incoming team in order to kind of let them know what's going on in the executive branch, right? And this started in I think in 2000 after the Bush Gore election and the Florida recount and everything. It got so it truncated that transition, so they decided that it had to be more organized. And so Obama's team had been so impressed with the great job that the Bush team had done in preparing the briefings for them that they prepared these great, binders and briefings for whoever was going to come next. Of course, they assumed it would be Hillary Clinton, but it was going to be for whoever came in. And of course, the Trump team had no interest in getting the briefings and planning for a transition. Sometimes they didn't even show up to the meetings they were supposed to have with the different agencies, or they sent people who lacked the proper clearance to even hear the briefings, or they just sent like one guy, as opposed to like a whole team. And so Michael Lewis did what the Trump team did not. He basically got versions of these briefings himself, and he went and interviewed people at 3 cabinet agencies: Department of Commerce, Agriculture, and Energy. Probably the 3 departments that sound like the least sexy parts of it's not like, the State Department or the Pentagon or the Treasury, right? He went to Commerce, Agriculture, and Energy. But he found that what they did was so vital to the functioning of the government and to the survival of the country, because they're managing catastrophic risks, whether involving weather or involving nukes, right? Or just simply collecting data so we know what is going on. Department of Commerce is basically, they have nothing to do with trade. It's a data collection department.
Right.
And so, it's a book that lionizes, correctly so, the deep expertise that is available and at work in the federal government, and shows the great dangers when that expertise is either ignored or, worse yet, degraded. And that is a book that I read before the pandemic, and even then it seemed extraordinarily important. After the pandemic, or during the pandemic, it just feels utterly prophetic. And it's a book, when people ask me to choose 1 or 2 or 3 key books that you'd want people to read out of this period, that's really one of them. It shows you that these conversations about the deep state and holdovers from a prior administration are just almost ludicrous when you think about the tasks that they have to carry out day to day.
Thank you for that review online right now. It was great. Your 9th chapter is Russian lit, right? So
yes.
You talked about the whole Russia hoax, right? So,
that's one that I was so sick of, because I was thinking I wasn't going to write a Russia chapter, and my wife, arguing contrary to her own interests, said you can't write about the Trump era and not have a book about Russia. I mean, not have a chapter about Russia. So the book, I was delayed because I added a chapter about.
Well, but you added some amazing writers like Masha Gessen and Timothy Snyder.
Yeah,
you did some great things with that.
And Michael McFaul, who was the American ambassador to Russia during the Obama years, and I think they were really important stories. I think that and a book that was one of the last books I added to this book, called Rigged by David Scheimer, which looks at the long history of voting interference and election interference between Moscow and Washington for 100 years. And the final chapter is called it's about all the books on democracy and the risks to democratic governance in the United States. And you often had these democracy experts who spent their careers looking at the failings of democracy around the world and never thought they'd be writing about similar problems here, like Larry Diamond and Ziblatt and Levitsky.
In some ways, I found in our bookstore, a number of those books were probably the biggest sellers of any of these books. Like On Tyranny was one of the first books to really, really sell. That's a very slight Timothy Snyder book. And it was basically just his distillation of everything that he's ever studied about tyrannical governments. And in a way, it was a warning shot. It came out very, very early in the presidency as well.
Yeah. So these books behind me are all books that I've reviewed for the Post or written about in my own book. And it's funny, I look at them, and some, I hate to say it, some I like barely remember, what was in them. I have to go back and look at my review to figure, oh yeah, that's what I thought about that book. That's what that was about. Timothy Snyder's book is the exact opposite. Timothy Snyder's On Tyranny is a book that, like, I remember where I was in my house when I read. I remember the weather. I remember how I felt that day. I mean, it came at just the perfect moment, right? It weirdly started as a Facebook posting. He wrote on Facebook, like, here are 20 lessons of, the World War II era and interwar Germany, and you see how tyrannical regimes, how fascism emerges. And it was published right around the time that the administration had just assumed power. The travel ban had just gone into, whatever version of effect it had tried to go into. And it just spoke at a very visceral level. I remember what struck me when I first read it was Snyder's very ominous warnings, like post-truth is pre-fascism, all these kind of stuff. But then I read it again 3 years later when I was working on the book. And then it was no less intense, but different things leapt out at me, right? And because at one moment you're anticipating, at another moment you're looking back through what you've lived, right? And what I realized there is that it's actionable advice, not just its warnings for how to anticipate, what might go wrong, but the actionable advice for how to deal with it was so much more powerful to me 3 years later. Like, how it is that you need to protect, almost like pick the institutions that you care about and find ways to protect them, and realize that you can't have tyranny without, compliant judges and lawyers and journalists and, trade associations. And that to me seemed so much more relevant looking back than it had been looking forward at the time. And, those are the best books, the ones that every time you read them are different and never stop telling you what they have to tell you in different ways, because you're different too. Like the best books are the ones that I keep reviewing in my head, always, even if I never pick them up again.
And many of those books are the books that affirm what you said when we started this, that just because Trump will leave office doesn't mean that we will not have Trumpism to deal with. I recently saw a really wonderful interview with Masha Gessen, who was talking really about Viktor Orban and his rise, and the fact that in his very first election, after he had won, he lost. He was not reelected. And then he came roaring back 4 years later with a super majority and basically took over at that point. And so it's those people who I think are looking at other kind of regimes around the world, which makes us look beyond ourselves. And I think that's what you're saying about Timothy Snyder as well, I think.
It's certainly one of those. Gessen's work is like that. A book I didn't get the chance to include in my book is Anne Applebaum's Twilight of Democracy. Yeah, and it also provides those kind of warnings that I think are really helpful. I think writers who have the benefit of seeing these kind of transitions and democratic deteriorations in other countries around the world, in Europe, in Latin America, have a lot to teach us. And certainly Snyder, Applebaum, Gessen, they've all borne witness to that as scholars, as activists, and just as citizens.
And then you do something at the end in your epilogue, which, all of us readers and booksellers who want to add books to a section or a display are thankful for. And that is, you basically select the books that you believe are the most meaningful of the ones that you read. I won't have you go through all of them, but it's Jennifer Silva and Timothy Snyder that we talked about, The End of Myth, and then there's some that I had really not heard of before, which I was so glad to see you choose as well. That was a really smart, interesting way of kind of ending it all.
Thank you. I did that right. That wasn't part of the plan. And I thought the book was, my draft was done, and it was with the publisher, and they were working on it. And then weirdly, it was when I was reading some of the obituaries of Harold Bloom, the literary critic who passed away last year.
And there was a book just published by him.
Yes.
I guess a posthumous book.
Yes. And when I was reading some of his obituaries, they were making reference to the books he had written about the Western canon, and how in one of them he had added this appendix at the end where he basically listed, these are the books that are part of the Western canon. If they're not here, they don't belong in the Western canon. Right. And I thought, God, you got to have some guts to do that. But I thought, that gave me the idea of what if I add something at the end that, in some ways, gathers what for me have been the most useful and important books. And what I say there is that, that list would be different for each person, and no one's list is better than anyone else's, because it really depends on your own blind spots and your own silos, and what it is that you feel you need to understand best. And these are the ones that really helped me. And again, but because times change, if I were to write a similar list 2 years from now, it might be different, and I do hope there will be, I do hope that some of the best books on the Trump era have really yet to be written, and I'll be reviewing them.
I just want to talk about one book which was extremely surprising to me when I read it, and that's Mary Trump's book, which is in some ways unclassifiable, really, because it really is a memoir, but it really is probably the most intimate portrait of Donald Trump that we have. But she really did something very kind of interesting. She really made it more about herself and her father, which gave it that sort of patina of being something deeper and not just a kind of get even with my big bad uncle sort of a book that it could have been, Yeah.
Now that book, to me, of all the quote unquote tell-all books that that have come out, was just felt utterly unique. It was someone who, first of all, had such a unique vantage point on this man and this family, as the niece of the president, the granddaughter of Fred Trump, the patriarch. But also, she has her whole academic background is in clinical psychology,
right.
And also trained in sort of writing and literature as well. And so that's kind of like you couldn't create someone in a lab that you'd more want to read on this subject. But what I appreciate as well is that she just puts, all the people who write about, all the insiders who write about Trump have some kind of axe to grind, some kind of agenda or angle that you kind of have to suss out, or it might be obvious. In her case, it's very clear, right? She was she and her brother were cut out of the family fortune. Her father, Freddie Trump, was treated horribly by her grandfather and by Donald. So she has a clear axe to grind, but she doesn't hide it. It's evident that here is where she was coming from in telling the story. And so once you accept that, then you can just dive into it. And I think that was, if people always think which book is going to change everything and which book is going to make people think finally now, this will turn his voters against him. And it was this pointless wait every time, because no one book was going to do that. And that's not their purpose. You can't judge them like that. And Mary Trump's book just gave us an amazing insight into this family. And in a weird way, I think of all the reasons that Donald Trump probably hated the book, the top reason is that he wasn't the main character of the story, right? It was his father. It was his father, Fred Trump, that was really, really the the animating force in this
Right.
family.
And his brother was in it. You know, his brother who got some sense of you felt sorry for him. You're absolutely
Yeah.
right. So let's turn it. For those of you watching, this is amazing. Make sure you go and get it. But I want to talk a little bit, just briefly, about Carlos himself, because you know a lot of people here watching are book lovers, and I'm sure they read reviews. And I think in a very short, little encapsulated way, tell us how you do your business. How do you review a book from the moment you choose it to the moment it comes out in the Washington Post?
My great tragedy in this job is that I'm a slow reader, and and also because I'm not reading just for pleasure, but reading to try to explain a subject and in some ways pass judgment on a subject for post readers. I take that very seriously, and I read each book that I review 3 times. And that is, I mean, unless it's like a rush job, like, I had to basically read Obama's book like in 2 days and write on it immediately.
That'd be a hard one to read 3 times.
Yeah, that I could. I don't think even if I had all the time in the world would I read that book 3 times. But there's books like James Comey's memoir or Barack Obama's memoir that I have to read once and I just write. But if I have time, as I normally do, because I get the books well in advance, I go through them 3 times. The first is just the most detailed read, lots of notes, and I go to the footnotes, and sometimes I go look at other books that have, insight on similar subjects. But then, once I'm done, I go through it again, and mainly reread the portions that struck me most the first time and kind of read around them to see, what to better remember their particular context. And then, that's a quicker read, but still kind of a full read. The third time I open up a file on my computer and I go through the material that really struck me most the second time, which I kind of highlighted. And then I dump all of that into a file, which has, quotes and notes and questions and ideas and connections. That's when I'm like, wait, this point from page 172, relates to the point on page 381, and I just dump all that in a file, and roughly it works out to about 1,000 words of text per 100 pages of the book. So a 300-page book might generate like a 3,000-word file, or a 500 generates a 5,000-word file. And that file becomes my raw material for the review. So I set the book aside entirely at that point, and I just focus on all this stuff, and all these ideas. And from there, I start kind of constructing a review. And, authors sometimes don't, like where I end up on their book, but I think they at least should know that I take each book very seriously. And at that point, actually, writing doesn't take me that long because I've already kind of digested the book so much and I know what I think about it. It's that process of like going through it 3 times, writing the stuff in the file, that takes forever and it's painful. But once I've done that, then I can really write.
With a typical book, how long is that process from the time you begin to the time the review appears?
If it's about 2 books or maybe 2 days or 2.5 days to read a book, then probably a day and a half to do the other kind of writing and developing all those notes and all that material. So about 4 days with a book before I can even begin to write.
So do you have are you on a deadline? Do you have to do a review a week? What is your?
It depends on when I first started the job, that was it. I had to review every week, and so that was it, because it would be about 4 days before I could start writing, and then you write on the 5th day and the 6th day, and then the 7th day you rest, and then you start again.
Columnist.
And but the way the job has evolved for me is that often I might review like 4 or 5 books together, and on a single subject, and so then I'll that might take a few weeks, to really absorb all that And then, but I can't do those too often, unfortunately. Like I have to pick my spots every year, how many times I'm going to like peel off and write one of those big essays.
Well, the fact of the matter is, Carlos, that you do it so well. And I know that Christina mentioned this, but in 2019, you won the Pulitzer Prize. And I'll just read to you from the citation. Carlos received the Pulitzer Prize, and this is what the Pulitzer Committee said. He received it for trenchant and searching reviews and essays that joined warm emotion and careful analysis in examining a broad range of books addressing government and the American experience. And Carlos, you've certainly done it in this new book of yours, and you do it every time you pick up a book and review it. And I think for the audience, which they'd get a little bit of a thrill from, I think somewhere on that shelf back there is the Pulitzer Award. Do you have it there? Do you want to show it to us a little bit?
So you get two things when you win that. You get a little diploma that looks like a college diploma, and you get this kind of nice crystal. And yeah, that's it. So there, I put it with the book. You can see it there. Yeah.
Perfectly aligned. So Carlos, what's next for you? Do you have another book that you have in mind? Or
I have a few ideas for possible books. For a while, I just kind of want to read books and review them because the whole book writing process is kind of exhausting, and I worry in a sense that this experience will give me way too much sympathy for authors now, and I have to just be kind to everyone that I review. But one idea is to write in a way, take the structure of this book that I've written now, but try to stretch it across a much larger canvas and try to think about some of the ways in which America, almost in shorthand ways, has defined itself in the past. The land of opportunity, a nation of immigrants, the shining city on a hill, and to take, maybe like a dozen of those, the melting pot, all these different ways, and explore each of them, but not just largely through books, but also through film and theater and poetry and art.
Cultural analysis. Yeah, that's fantastic.
And try to see how our thinking on all those different self-perceptions has evolved over the centuries, and what we can still rescue from each of them as we try to fashion something today.
That's a wonderful idea. Carlos, I can't thank you enough. I know we have a short period of time for questions, and I think Christine is going to join us.
It's actually been such a fascinating conversation that we're almost at the hour right now. But
I'm sorry.
Can we go a little longer? Or
sure, but you answered actually Mitchell asked you one of the questions was about your next project. So you've just answered that. And
that's a possible next project. I don't have a book deal. I don't have the time.
Well, we'll work on that, Carlos. I'm sure that'll happen.
And then we have a question here from Mark Trowbridge, our friend Mark. Hi, Carlos. Could you have predicted a president who refuses to concede or allow for a peaceful and positive transition based on your earlier research and readings?
I think the remarkable thing about Trump is that you didn't need to read anything to make that prediction, because he told us he was going to do it, because he contested the results of an election that he won in 2016, when he said that that there were millions of votes cast illegally, right? And just like we knew that he would have contested 2016 as rigged if he had lost, he was going to do the same now. He basically telegraphed it very, very clearly. It's amazing because I think we may have hit on this a little bit earlier, but so many of these moments in the Trump presidency have been completely shocking in the way that they violate accepted norms of presidential behavior, but yet entirely unsurprising because that's who we've gotten to know so well over the last 4 years. The fact that he would do this is completely predictable. And fortunately, you didn't need to read 150 books to know. You just had to listen to him.
Christina, anything else?
That's it. That's what we have. So I think
it's great to get a question from Mark. Mark is our one most amazing head of the Chamber of Commerce, who has done more for small business than anyone I can imagine. So it was very fitting that we get that last question from Mark. And Carlos, you will always be one of us. Come and visit on your next trip down. I hope we can see each other in the physical world, share a coffee, talk about more stuff. But keep doing what you're doing. And thank you so much from all of us readers for doing what you do.
Thank you so much. This was a real pleasure.
You're brilliant, Carlos. Thank you so much.
Ay, mil gracias.
A ti. And happy Thanksgiving to everyone.
Yes,
Stay safe.
Thanksgiving to everyone.
Buy a book just by clicking on the red, was it green? A little green thing on the bottom.
Green button.
It's
yes.
green, yes.
Make sure you buy
And to your mom, Maya.
Mami, Rosy, Sabrina, Lucas, un beso.
Muchas gracias.
Yes, thank you all.
Good evening. Bye.
Good night, everyone.
Good